Order, order. Well, welcome everybody to the latest meeting of the Environmental Audit Committee, and particularly the first meeting looking at the issue of airport expansion and the contribution that will make to the climate and nature goals. I'm very pleased to be joined by our opening panel. If I could firstly thank you all for coming to give evidence to us, and invite you, starting with Mr Beckford on my left, to just introduce yourselves and the organisation you work for, the role that you play there. So, first of you, yourself, Mr Beckford.
Thank you for having me. My name is Johann Beckford. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at Green Alliance. We're a charity and think tank focusing on ambitious environmental leadership, and our work covers climate mitigation, adaptation, nature restoration, resources in the circular economy.
Excellent, thank you, Ms Hicks.
Hi, I'm Celeste Hicks. I'm the Policy Manager at the Aviation Environment Federation. We work on all things aviation environment, so noise, climate, air pollution and nature impacts. Just quickly wanted to say thank you for having this inquiry. We really welcome the opportunity to discuss these issues. We don't think there is an environmental safeguard on airport expansion, given the complexity of the interactions on the policies, so I hope that we get the chance to discuss that today.
Excellent, thank you very much. Professor Miller.
I'm Professor Rob Miller. I'm Director of the Whittle Laboratory at the University of Cambridge, and I'm one of the co-leads of what's called the Aviation Impact Accelerator, which is a global modelling and convening group that brings together industry, academia and government to accelerate the pathway to net zero flight.
Well, thank you very much. If I could start with you, Ms Hicks, please. How significant are emissions from aviation in the context of UK emissions as a whole?
Okay, so they currently represent about 9% of the UK's emissions. We actually just did some number crunching on the most recent DESNES figures, which suggest, we have to just say this was with not including domestic emissions because they haven't come out yet, but according to DESNES, so we're making an estimation for the domestic emissions. They're actually slightly higher than 2019, so around 37.4 megatons at the moment. And we know that international emissions from aviation are higher than they were in 2019. So just to say, put that in context, by 2040, the Climate Change Committee expects that aviation will be the highest emitting sector of all the economy sectors. We basically just want to draw attention to the fact that despite there being this trajectory promised in the Jet Zero strategy that emissions from aviation would be falling, as far as we can see in 2024, there's no evidence of that.
Okay, Professor Miller.
Could I add to that half the climate impact of aviation is non-CO2 effects, and these non-CO2 effects, the biggest effect is the clouds that are formed by aviation. Those clouds trap heat. 1 in 20 flights creates a cloud, and in 6 hours that cloud warms the Earth, equivalent to the CO2 from all the 20 planes over 100 years. Now, if you work those out together, it's about half the effect, but the size of that effect is quite uncertain. So we need to consider both effects today.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Come back to you, Professor Miller. How are these carbon emissions projected to change on current trajectories out to 2050? And what impact do you anticipate that the kind of growth that we are currently anticipating might become the policy of the government? What kind of impact would that have?
Well, the growth is hard to exactly measure because it's a comparison of what the size of aviation emissions will be compared to other sectors which are also decarbonising. But the Aerospace Technology Institute, in their most recent report, estimated that to be at 39% of UK emissions in 2050. And obviously, that then becomes easily the largest fraction of UK emissions.
Yes. And from your perspective, why is the airport and aviation sector so hard to decarbonise?
Well, there's two effects going on here. So the weight, aviation is a weight game, and the energy per unit weight of jet fuel is particularly good. And battery electric flight or other solutions do not have that energy density. And so that makes it very hard technologically. It can't just be electrified in the same way. But the second thing is the timescales involved in the problem. To develop the technology, certify the technology, deploy the technology, and then the fact that aircraft are in service for 25, 30 years means the time constants are large. So you put together this hard technology with this time constant, and that makes it easily the hardest sector to decarbonise.
And from your perspective, as Hicks, is this an issue that you see improving, or do you think that what we're hearing from the sector about the extent to which they are decarbonising, do you have confidence that is possible?
So I think the UK government...
Sorry, I was just asking Ms. Hicks if
That's okay. I mean, what I just said about the fact that emissions are at 2019 levels, and 2019 was supposed to be the peak year for emissions. So I know, we need to consider what's happened during the pandemic, but, 2024 now appears to be the peak year. So I think, you can take from that what you want about how effective decarbonisation has been so far. I think, one of the things you need to look at is where are we now with the delivery of all these technologies. It's not to say that we won't be there in the future, so sustainable aviation fuels and greenhouse gas removals and zero emissions flights and all the things that we want to talk about, they may all deliver in the future. And in fact, I quite hope they do. But as things stand right now, just to give you some context, sustainable aviation fuel is about 0.3% of global aviation fuel today. I think we've got something like just over 9% of the fuel required to meet the UK SAF target by 2030. That's 4.5 years away. We need to scale that industry by 10% from today's levels. If you look at greenhouse gas removals, this one always makes my eyes pop out. We've got something like half a megaton of greenhouse gas removals working in the entire globe at the moment. And if you look at the Jet Zero projections for what the UK aviation sector on its own will need by then, it's quite astounding, the gaps between that. So I think it's not to say that we can't say that technology will deliver, it's just if it's going to deliver, it needs to happen much more quickly than it is.
Yeah, thank you. Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Chair. And just to ask a bit more about the carbon budgets that we've got coming up. Should the government, and this is to Mr. Beckford, should the government include international aviation emissions within the carbon budgets, and would you be surprised if they did not?
Yes, well, so my short answer to that is yes, that they should. I think there's a very clear moral as well as environmental case for them being included. I think this has been set out by the CCC in the past. Well over 90% of aviation emission impacts from a CO2 perspective are international. So if we were to suddenly ignore international aviation, then we would essentially not be telling the truth about the right kind of impact levels that we need to consider. So that's something that urgently needs to be incorporated. But the sixth carbon budget already does include international aviation and shipping, and Parliament has signed off upon that, which is great. But there is a little bit of a sort of wrinkle here, if you like, in that the government still does need to formally legislate for international aviation and shipping emissions to be included in the Climate Change Act targets. So we're in this slightly weird limbo situation where the sixth carbon budget does include it, but we actually need to officially incorporate it in the targets. And that's something that's easily enough done via secondary legislation. We just need to assign the parliamentary time. And I know there's obviously a lot of pressure on parliamentary time these days. But if you didn't legislate for international aviation and shipping emissions to be incorporated into Climate Change Act targets, then we'd be in a slightly strange position where carbon budget 6 in the mid-2030s would effectively be overinflated, and you'd then have to potentially adjust what that target is to be focused purely on domestic sources of emissions. And I'm not sure it's that we're quite in the political space where we want to turn back to drivers potentially, or to roll out cleaner heating systems more quickly, if we want to cut the number of miles driven on our roads, or those other kind of interventions that may have to take place if we continue to give aviation a kind of privileged position where it's not being incorporated in our emissions targets. So I think that's really crucial. And at Green Alliance, we recently did a piece of work. We published a piece of work called Mind the Gap at the start of this year that was based on the pathway towards the sixth carbon budget. So how we get on track with that, because before previous carbon budgets were set, before net zero was actually agreed upon in 2019. And that highlights that there's a 97 million tonne emissions gap for the transport sector as a whole to close in the years preceding the sixth carbon budget, which is pretty significant. But fortunately, our excellent report has closed it, which you can all find on our website. But the crucial thing I think to highlight here is that we incorporate aviation and shipping in these calculations, because trying to do it without aviation and shipping is really, really hard, basically. And when you start to throw into the mix the idea that 50% of people in the UK don't fly in a given year, and that's overwhelmingly, that's much higher amongst people on the lower end of the income spectrum, then there is really a justice argument here that we have to incorporate aviation into our emissions projections, and we have to incorporate it into our targets. So I'd advocate that that is something that we should certainly be doing.
Kind of preempted my next question, but I guess just going back to kind of that report then, what would the kind of reduction look like that you're to close that gap, and kind of what's your view of trying to achieve the carbon budget in terms of aviation for...
Yeah, so I mean, it's easy to, we can draw on the Climate Change Committee's work here on the sixth carbon budget. So they specifically say if we were to just follow a business as usual trajectory, then emissions would be around 13 million tonnes higher in 2035 than they'd otherwise be. So that's something that we obviously need to put policy in place now in order to sort of have that gradual transition, which I'd absolutely urge everyone to advocate for. In terms of annual emissions, that would be around 30.5 million tonnes of aviation emissions in 2035. So to put that in context, that's a 13.8% decrease on 2023 emissions. And actually the figures that Celeste highlighted earlier that the AEF have been looking at would actually be a greater level of reduction if 2024 is actually going up. And it seems to suggest there are, with as many more passengers, 20 million more passengers actually travelled in 2024 than 23. So again, this is something that we need to start looking at the policy process as soon as possible. And I would just, I guess, link that to the need for a broader strategy on policies that we can put in place now, and that really is pulling a sort of broader demand management lever. I think some of the technologies that we've mentioned already are absolutely vital to in the coming years and decades to come, but at this stage a lot of them are either unproven or not scalable. So we need to we certainly need to be making progress now so that we can give kind of the breathing room to the rest of the sector to be able to scale those technologies over time.
We'll come back to demand management later, but what impact would integration of the emissions into the carbon budget have on the actual likelihood of achieving those budgets?
So again, this is an interesting question in that we've adopted the carbon budget as it is with international aviation and shipping in the mix. And so if we were to not legislate for the targets, then we've overinflated that effectively. And instead of just letting that slide, we would have to tighten that budget in order to get the level of decarbonisation needed. So the CCC suggests that we should be cutting a cumulative emissions figure level of 13 megatons by 2035. So you'd have to presumably, the sort of corollary of that is it would be the budget itself would have to be that much tighter by that period of time. And again, I'd link this back to really ultimately the fairness argument of this, that aviation is really in a privileged policy position, and we should be we need to sort of level that playing field, if you like, with, driving or with the future challenges around agriculture or other sort of tough to decarbonise sectors, industry as well. So if we're just to leave aviation, then we're creating a rod for our own back further down the line.
No, we've kind of already heard on this, but just finally, given that only one of the 50 targets that have been set for the industry since 2000 has been met, how likely is it, do you think, that the targets that we're talking about are going to be met?
Yeah, I think
answer on that if you want.
The track record isn't great, I think is fair to say, and I think I think that report is actually from Possible, who are coming up next, and so shout out to them for some great work. But the track record, it really isn't good. A lot of those targets are self-declared targets, and so that really highlights the need for there to be a government-led strategy that really takes us on a pathway towards net zero, rather than just kind of allowing airlines and airports to be able to set their own targets and then inevitably, unfortunately, miss them.
Chris Hinchliffe.
Thank you, Chair. Back to you, Mr. Beckford. Academics from University of Manchester have highlighted that airport expansion locks in emissions for decades to come. In the report that you co-authored, which you've already referred to today, you called, or Green Alliance called, for a moratorium on airport expansion. Is that still Green Alliance's position? And do you believe the government and the Climate Change Committee are getting this wrong?
So it is still my position. I think we should be calling for a moratorium on airport expansion. I think a really interesting part of this debate is, does a moratorium on airport expansion mean that people can't fly in future, or there can't be an increasing number of people flying in future? And actually, no, that's not the case. There's plenty of capacity within airports as they currently exist for more people to fly. In fact, if you look at the 6th carbon budget advice from the CCC, they recommend around a 25% increase in passenger numbers, but with no net expansion of infrastructure. And so that is something that can perfectly possibly take place. I think what's interesting is, I know recent advice from the Climate Change Committee in the 7th carbon budget didn't explicitly talk about airport expansion, but if you kind of dig into the numbers, actually the message is still relatively clear. By 2050, the CCC suggests that around 400 million or so passengers could travel in 2050, which is still a very significant increase. It's a 28% increase on today, which is we're just short of the 300 million mark. But if you were to take all of the airport expansions that are currently on the table, and actually these aren't my figures, but these are shout out to AEF who produce these figures, then we're likely to be seeing more in the region of 500 million passengers travelling per year. Now that's a pretty big gap of 100 million people that are going to be travelling, and I think ultimately that speaks for itself, and that we should be placing that moratorium in order to give ourselves the breathing room over time to develop those technologies.
Well, could I just add on to that?
I'm just going to come to you, and then I'll bring you in, Professor Miller. So, Ms. Hicks, as has just been alluded to there, the CCC are effectively saying that demand management through price controls can achieve the same outcome as constraining airport capacity growth. But as we've just heard, allowing the expansion plans for the UK airports to go ahead, and apologies for effectively quoting your own figures back to you, would get us to capacity for 506 million passengers per year, when the CCC, it says that passenger numbers need to be limited to 402 million per year, which, as has been said, fits within existing capacity. The reality is that airports are going to want to do everything in their power to make full use of the additional capacity, aren't they? Having invested in it, once again, corporate motives are going to override environmental imperatives, aren't they?
I mean, I don't run an airport, I'm not in charge of the business, but yes, I would imagine it's that, and I'm fairly sure that no airport would make the decision to go ahead and spend that much money on the infrastructure if they weren't sure that they would reach the demand that they think they can potentially achieve. So I think one of the interesting questions is just how does that play out across the country, because there's interactions, particularly in the southeast, between the runways in the southeast, so Luton, Gatwick, Stansted, London City, Heathrow, all kind of playing for that southeastern market. Obviously there are interactions between where the demand goes in that, but each of those businesses is going to want passengers to go to their airport. And actually one of the things that we picked up on the Jet Zero modelling is that we're not aware that any modelling was done on the assumption that all of those airports, if they did get what they asked for, what would happen if all of them filled up to capacity. And obviously the business model would dictate that you should fill up to capacity. We're not aware of any modelling that's been done to say that what would happen in terms of emissions if all of those airports got what they wanted.
Thank you. I'm just going to come to you, but would you like to come in?
Well, I'd just like to come in on this. So our modelling, based on the DFT, shows that the increase in emissions, if you go for airport expansion, is 6.3 million tonnes CO2 equivalent, which is a 16% increase. The passenger numbers from the modelling from the DFT, which we've gone over, which I think are pretty sound, are 463 million passengers in 2050. If you have airport expansion. And it's important to realise that 2/3 of the expansion happens with or without airport expansion, the expansion in passenger numbers. It's an important point, though, to say that airport expansion itself is not inherently clean or polluting. It depends on the matter of the aviation that you run through those airports. So it really depends more on whether we are on track to net zero by 2050 for aviation, not on the expansion.
Okay, well, let me press you on that point, then, Professor Miller, because I was recently reading analysis that said if the government proceeds with the expansions at Luton, Gatwick and Heathrow for reasons of GDP, for reasons of wanting Bedford Universal Studios to happen, if we end up there, to meet our carbon budgets, we'd have to plant a forest twice the size of Greater London by 2028. That's equivalent to all the trees we've planted this millennium in 3 years. I mean, it's not realistic, isn't it? Don't we need to face up to the fact that if we go ahead with all of this airport expansion, we will blow our carbon budgets, and thinking otherwise is just wishful thinking?
So all numbers in aviation are big. Right, so you can quote one number, another number, and you can say that's very large. It's a 16% increase in carbon emissions will be caused in the best analysis I've seen by the DFT, which we've gone over with the tooth comb. I would advise more analysis to be done, because in their analysis they focus on Heathrow and Gatwick expansion, and we had to expand those numbers to the other airports, and I think that's something the committee could ask to be done. It's 16% increase on a big number. We desperately need to raise ambition. At the moment, aviation is, I think the British government is doing better than any other government in the world when it comes to driving SAFs and airport modernisation, but I think we need to be much bolder. And I think if we're bolder, we can get to net zero aviation by 2050.
Thank you for an excellent recommendation for me to end on.
Thank you very much, John. Bring Ruth Cadbury in first.
Yeah, we've been focusing on expansion and taking the rise in demand as read. I'd like to probe, I don't mind which of you, but what is causing the rise in demand? Who is flying more? Is it Brits flying abroad? Is it overseas people bringing money and jobs to whatever to the UK? Is it long haul, short haul? What is the growth of the demand, Johann?
So I have one intervention. I'm sure my other panellists have other things to say, but I think one thing that's interesting in this debate is that it's often framed as very much an economic argument, and that's actually something from the previous question that was highlighted. But I think the economic returns that you would see from airport expansion are actually diminishing returns over time. The peak in business travel occurred in 2006, 2007. So this is pre-financial crisis kind of times. And, you know, we've all lived through the last 15 years or so to understand that now you can operate businesses in new ways, and we've all pivoted in that way. So it shows that the growth in flights is actually largely leisure travel. Now, this is absolutely not a thing about going against anyone being on holiday. That's absolutely not what we're talking about. But it's interesting that still, despite that growth in leisure travel, around 50% of the population don't fly in a given year. And we've seen from the stats that that's more likely to be the case if you're in a lower income group. So again, we are seeing that it's wealthier, frequent flyers that are often picking up the slack, and there isn't, in my mind, a particularly compelling reason why that suddenly would change with airport expansion. So likely it'll be still wealthier groups who are able to pick up the slack.
And is it Brits flying abroad or overseas people spending money in the UK?
So, yeah, this is an interesting question. So we have, at the moment, the latest stats I've seen, I haven't seen the change over time, but in 2023, we're actually running a £41 billion tourism deficit. So Brits are spending more abroad than foreign tourists are spending here. So again, another sort of another column that's supposed to hold up the economic, the economic argument really doesn't really hold water, unfortunately.
Thank you. Samuel Wilson.
The the Jet Zero strategy and also the carbon budget delivery plan didn't mention demand management. Why do you think that was the case?
You want me to take that one? So I think one of the things I wanted to get across today was to just sort of lodge in everybody's head what do we mean by demand management. So it does mean different things to different people. Reading lots of the court cases around these issues, it can mean something as simple as a cap in passenger numbers, but it can also mean financial levers that are placed onto any activity that happens to dampen demand. So actually Jet Zero did mention demand management if you accept that broader discussion of it, because I think it's 27% of the emissions reductions that we need by 2050 in Jet Zero come from carbon pricing. So that's either the the UK emissions trading system or CORSIA, which is the international trading system. So that's, you know, a quarter of the emissions savings coming from effectively that carbon price dampening demand. So I think it's really important to just think what do we mean by that. And by the way, I just wanted to add on as well that in that scenario from Jet Zero where they talk about this 27% demand reduction, I think the carbon price that they were assuming there was £378 a tonne. It's currently about £40 a tonne. So if you think how big the gap is between what's being put into that modelling, assuming that that's a big chunk of the demand reduction they need. So I think just, you know, I'd encourage everybody to see demand reduction or growth in demand management, unconstrained demand, to just see it's a slightly more subtle term than just saying we're going to stop people flying.
I think that one of the reasons, though, why demand management hasn't been to the forefront in these discussions so far is because the impact on a wide range of people, whether it's those who like to take their holidays abroad, and we shouldn't deny them that, people who fly for business and it's necessary, or indeed the increasing amount of air traffic which is taken up with taking exports abroad for many of our high value industries, that all of those groups would be heavily impacted by the kinds of things, and we could discuss the kind of impact that demand management to get the targets would have in a moment or two. But there are a whole range of people who would be affected by it, and politically that's difficult.
Yeah, and I understand that, and actually none of these scenarios that we're talking about are suggesting that anybody, as the current situation is, flies less. Even the Climate Change Committee said that demand can grow by 25%. So it's, you know, it's just it's not nobody's proposing a sort of hammer to crack a what's the phrase, using a sledgehammer to crack a walnut. It's demand management is a subtle term, and I think sometimes it can get politicised. That people are telling everybody else what to do, and actually, you know, there is a definite pricing signal that comes in. And, you know, just to sort of go back to aviation as a special case, you know, and a regular reminder that aviation pays no tax on its fuel, which I think people are always surprised to hear. You know, motorists pay tax on their fuel, but aviation does not pay tax on its fuel. So aviation is already artificially cheap compared with other sectors.
The Climate Change Committee has suggested that reductions of 15% based on the 2018 peak. That is bound to have an impact on the number of flights and the number of people who can afford those flights. If you're to achieve those kind of targets, I mean, if you're going to use a pricing mechanism or else a cap or frequent flyer restrictions, then that is going to have an impact economically on individuals, is it not, and businesses?
I mean, as Johann was saying, like, we're in favour of that financial burden being passed more fairly across society, so the people who do the most polluting would pay the most, and the people who do the least polluting would pay the least.
Well, I think the figure of 57% of air travel was for leisure, and the comment made to reduce that would be to price out the marginal traveller. Now, the marginal traveller is likely the people who are least likely to be able to afford the price increase. So, you know, while there may be a large percentage of people, 50% I think was the figure given in any given year, who don't fly, many of those who do fly are there on the margins, and that's what the demand management policies and those are the people who they'll be targeted at to try and reduce that.
Can I just jump in on that? I think this is where good policy making is really crucial. And so I think that's where focusing policy on frequent flyers is so crucial. So something like a frequent flyer levy that is deliberately looking at those who are taking their 5th, 6th, 7th flight of the year, that's the kind of flying where I think probably they could take 2 or 3 fewer flights per year and still be enjoying the fruits of international travel. And actually, you can design that in a way that the family who wants to go to Spain once a year can still take that without a significant price change. I think if we don't start to look at the proper sort of policy mechanisms in order to make this happen, then actually policy is going to have to sort of catch up by default over time, and that's where you start introducing bad policy. So if we think about it now and we can kind of put those things in place, then actually we can make this a much fairer approach. So that's why I think we can't just ignore the situation as it is, and we can make sure that it's the distributional impact of this is felt much more fairly.
I'd like to know how practically that can happen, but leave that aside. You've mentioned, I think one of you mentioned that 2/3 of the increase that's predicted in air travel could be facilitated within existing airports without having any airport expansion. What impact does that intensification of the existing airports have on noise, pollution, etc.?
I'm not an expert on noise by any stretch of the imagination, so perhaps others may be able to come in. What I would say, though, is that obviously any increase in passenger numbers has an impact, but expansion within existing facilities will only have an impact to a certain extent. Whereas if you're looking to introduce further runways, for example, you have to increase the footprint of the airport. You have to then connect those up, so you're actually expanding the area with which people are travelling to the airport. You're also expanding where planes are literally landing, so you're increasing the potential for noise to be spread to a wider area. So I think actually within existing infrastructure is a much more sensible approach when it comes to noise or to air pollution as well as emissions.
Just to add, the DFT modelling shows that if you don't have expansions of airports, then the Heathrow and Gatwick fill, and people are travelling to airports which are not their first choice and are travelling further. Now, the consequences of that we don't understand, and more work again needs doing on that. But it is important to understand that the expansion or no expansion involves a different distribution of airports being used and a different distribution of travel.
And that's with regard to distribution within the UK, but also across Europe. So, you hear about people coming long haul, landing in Paris, landing in Amsterdam, and doing the last bit of their journey to the UK. Is that what you're referring to in terms of distribution? Not just people choosing to go to Luton in order to get to London, but people stopping off in Paris in order to get to London?
I mean, in the preparation to this, we've got a great team in the Aviation Impact Studies, and we did discuss this, though we have done no modelling on it. The DFT analysis only shows displacement within the UK, fixing the UK boundaries. I think the consequence will be displacement to Europe. People will be taking flights to hubs somewhere else and then flying out of those hubs. And there is no modelling at the moment that understands that mechanism, and I think that would be a natural part of any expanded analysis.
Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. If I may just ask one supplementary to the earlier question, which is that I've been listening to the advice coming from all of you that business travel peaked in 2006-07, that the number of international travellers coming to the UK and bringing their international spend is far lower than in reverse. So I suppose my question is the government's ambition around airport expansion is actually related to its desire for economic growth. So if we're going to drive up emissions and possibly not get the growth, are we on the wrong track?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on that. I think we are certainly on the wrong track. It's not a growth strategy to expand airports, essentially. That's a much harder, a bigger question that needs to look across sectors. We have the tourism spending deficit. There's also a suggestion that if you're expanding airports, whilst that's an infrastructure project on the ground, it's likely that often it's displacing economic activity from other regions, and particularly if you're looking in London and the southeast, then actually I think we can all agree that economic activity needs to be spread across the country rather than further concentrated in the southeast. So ultimately, I think the case for economic growth and airport expansion just aren't as linked as strongly as we may have thought in decades past, and we need to look more broadly if that's what the solution that we're trying to find.
Could I just jump in on that? So it's quite useful to go back to the Airports Commission, which was the piece of research that was done in the between 2013 and 2015 to support the production of the AMPS. And that basically looked at all the economic benefit analysis of the Heathrow third runway. There was lots and lots of discussion about the economic benefits at the time, huge discussions / disagreements about what the true impact was. But there was a sort of central case scenario which the DfT put forward, which was something in the area of, I think, about only 1 billion in net present value benefits across 60 years of the Heathrow third runway at that time. And in some of the cases it was actually a negative value across the whole economy. And obviously the inputs that you put into the economic model are complicated, but even back in 2015 when we were looking at that, the economic case for Heathrow expansion on its own was really not very convincing, just as the project. I mean, there are wider questions of the cost of, the impact of the infrastructure itself being built and the jobs created by the building of the infrastructure. But, if you put all of that into the mix using these models, it came out with quite an unconvincing figure. So I think it's just worth going back and looking at the Airports Commission, because a lot of discussion about this was back then, and obviously now GDP growth is not what we expected it in 2015, so the economic case would probably, I think, I haven't done the modelling myself, but I believe it would look weaker than it did even back then.
I really appreciate that input, and I'm going to move to the question I meant to be asking, because I'm going to take a...
Could I just slip in with a quick supplementary on that piece of work? Am I right, it was that piece of work by the Commission or the DfT that I believe said that the growing Heathrow, as you say, doesn't bring net economic benefits to the UK PLC, but actually drew growth away from the UK regions?
I'd have to get back to you on that one. I'd have to go read it again, but it did definitely model that it would draw growth away from other airports in the southeast, such as Gatwick, which is a big puzzle for me. 10 years ago, we said Heathrow is the only one that we need in the southeast, and it will draw growth away. Therefore, there won't be a case for Gatwick. Now we have a situation where suddenly there's growth for Gatwick, Luton, and Heathrow, as far as we understand it. So yeah, but we can get back to you with that.
Thank you.
Sorry, thank you.
Did you finish?
Yes. I was going to go on to the question I meant to be asking.
Okay.
Which and it's specifically to Professor Miller, and it's a combined question, which, obviously I note your optimism and your desire for boldness around reducing emissions, and I imagine that technology and technological innovation is going to be a central part of that. When do you expect that to come through, and what are the impacts that you expect to see?
Okay, that's a very good question. So you can think about aviation as potentially approaching what I would call a Tesla moment. So in about 2010, in automotive, everybody was saying we should focus on biofuels. Let's get biofuels over the line. Nobody knew that electrification of cars was going to come, the Tesla moment. In aviation, in a similar way, we should absolutely focus on delivering SAFs, and I think the government is doing that. But we have to maximise the chance of a Tesla moment. And there are a number of technologies which could cause those Tesla moments. One you may have heard of is liquid hydrogen as a fuel. Another one is liquid methane as a fuel. Another one is hybrid electric propulsion. And another one is synthetic biology, actually engineering the DNA to create creatures that can make fuels in a more efficient way. And I'm sure there are others. And it is really important with those technologies, because of the time scale involved in the development, deployment and change I talked about earlier. It's very important, if we're going to have those significantly delivering by 2050, that we need to move much faster. We need to act on a number of moonshot programs, and those moonshot programs demonstrators need to deliver by 2030 to give us confidence. Now, this is very positive for the UK, because this is like a Whittle moment. These are chances to build new industries for the UK, and the cost of those demonstrator programs is relatively low. I'll just give you 2 examples, I think, of things that the government should do. So the first one is we need to have large airspace-wide scale trials of contrail avoidance. So by changing aircraft slightly in altitude, you can remove this cloud formation, which is about half the climate effect of aviation. And if we started those trials immediately, then we could start to launch a system by 2030. And that has the potential to remove about 80% of that half, the non-CO2 effects, by 2050. So that's a huge number. In fact, globally, that is equivalent to about a quarter of our carbon budget to 1.5 degrees. So that's an amazing number. And we could do that immediately. We should as a country. The government should do that. The second one is these moonshot demonstrator programs. And to give you an idea, if we started doing that with hydrogen, we launched a program and it was successful by 2030, we could be getting 15 to 30% reduction in aviation emissions by 2050, scaling in our report to 30% to 70% by 2060. But it's incredibly dependent on action early. This is a critical 5 years for us to act.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
I just want to build very, very quickly on that and just sort of, I guess, link it back to the overarching question here. And I think sometimes we sort of put technology and demand side measures at loggerheads, and we kind of think that the two are automatically opposed. But I think actually one very much can support the other. If we're going to be able to scale some of the technologies in the coming decades, then the amount that we are flying and the amount of fuel that we're using, the amount of aircraft that we have, is fundamentally going to dictate the proportion with which those technologies are rolled out. So if we're trying to fly 500 million passengers around and we have to scale SAF to a percentage level, which is what the government SAF mandate does, then that is all the more difficult because of a higher demand for fuel. So actually, you can give technologies the breathing room to be able to scale and give yourselves the breathing room within the carbon budget as well, as we talked about earlier, if you take just a sensible approach to aviation growth, which is why I think those two are fundamentally linked.
Thank you very much. Anna Gelder.
Thank you, Chair. And we've covered some of what I was going to ask, which is great. So there's some interesting technological advancements there and several suggestions of what government should be doing. This could be a very simple yes or no answer, and I suspect I know what it will be. But is the government doing enough to support some of what you're suggesting there? And if not, is there anything you want to add to your asks of really interesting options that the government could take forward?
Okay, so well, I'll mention this, then I'll pass it over, if that's all right. Yeah. So I definitely think the UK government is being proactive on this, and I think on SAFs and airspace modernisation, they're doing really well. They're really focusing, leading. But and I've mentioned the moonshot programs, which I would go after, and the large airspace-wide trials that I would go after. But it's critical important, the one thing I want to add, that we do this in an agile way. And my own advice would be that these should be run through ARIA, the UK Advanced Research and Innovation Agency. These are relatively small sums of money, and we can go after these new industries. If by 2030 they don't happen, that's it, cut the programs. But we have to make decisions, and we have to do it in an agile way.
I was just going to chip in on that in terms of greenhouse gas removals as well, because if you go back to Jet Zero strategy, there is a huge chunk of the abatement needed by 2050 coming from removals, I think 37%. And as I said before, at the moment, it's something like 0.5 megatons of capacity in the whole world. So I think there's some work to be done by the government to think about how to stimulate the industry in greenhouse gas removals as well. So really, we're talking here direct air capture being the most kind of permanent form of removals, which is literally sucking the CO2 out and burying it underground. So I think there's a lot of policy work to be done there. If you look at the Jet Zero strategy, there's definitely technologies. The the new technologies need incentives and policy, but also the greenhouse gas removals. And I think just to sort of come back to the original question about the whole point, as I understood it for the inquiry, we really feel that, it would be much more sensible to give the technology time to take off before making decisions about moving forward with expansion. Because if you go ahead with the expansion, increase the demand, then you've got to work even harder if it doesn't work out. I was just looking at all these questions and thinking, it just suddenly dawned on me how much easier it would be in 5 years' time to answer this if we'd had time to see whether the technologies were working or not. So I think that's really the fundamental question for me.
Just very briefly, I think there is an opportunity potentially on technology and the economic benefits around it. So Green Alliance will be releasing some more research on the sort of potential for zero-emission aviation, zero-emission flight. And I think there's an interesting position here in UK's aerospace industry and our level of understanding, our research and development expertise, and our universities. Essentially, this is something that the UK is really good at. So potentially, if we are the heart of the future technologies and how we travel around the world, then there's a really big opportunity there. The Aerospace Technology Institute suggests something in the region of 36 billion gross value added, potentially, if we're the kind of leader here. So if we have those early mover benefits, then that's a real opportunity. But actually, we could also see some of those future jobs moving abroad if we are left behind. So I think there is a point here. Again, it's about putting a strategy in place so that we know what we're looking for. It's important, as Professor Miller said, to sort of catalyse the commercial demonstration of these technologies, and that's something we need to be looking at urgently.
Helpful recommendations. Thank
you. Sammy Wilson briefly, and then we'll come to Mr. Whittle.
Professor Miller, you've described a lot of the technologies and the investment that's required in them. Is it easier to get that investment if it is known there's going to be a market for the technologies in the future, and therefore airport expansion and the potential then that gives for more passengers could actually make it easier to get people to invest in the kind of technologies you're talking about?
I think it's an interesting point. I think expanding airports gives us an opportunity to show the world a model of an airport that facilitates a transition. A lot of these technologies require fuel changes, they require operations changes, and if I was agreeing to these expansions, I would be making sure these airports acted as demonstrators to the world, because most of the airports, the large airports that are going to be built in the future, are across Asia and Africa, where the major expansion in flight happens. And us demonstrating how you do that process, I think, is very important.
Thank you very much. John Whitney.
Question to Professor Miller. How much of an impact is SAF going to have on reducing our emissions, given its level of usage right now? Are we going to get to 6.3 megatons of carbon savings by 2040?
It's a really good question. It's a very hard question to answer. The SAF mandates are aiming at about 22% reduction by 2040, and they don't go past that. However, it's important to understand that meeting these mandates is a necessary but not sufficient solution for net zero by 2050. It's not going to solve the whole problem. It's part of the problem. And there's also a major environmental challenge in scaling SAFs, and that's the magnitude of waste biomass that's required. And this is because waste biomass is a key component of making the SAFs. Now, we estimate in our recent report that the total global waste biomass which is available in 2050 is somewhere between 50 and 160 exajoules. And the amount that all sectors will need in 2050 is between 80 and 190 exajoules. So the demand of all sectors, and aviation's a big one of those, is going to be larger than the amount we've got. This is a sort of a limbo bar we've got to get under, and that limbo bar is likely to move over time. Now, I would say a recommendation for the government is we need to lead internationally in making sure sourcing of biomass is of the highest quality and standard. And so I say that the key to take away here is that SAF is a good thing. We have to do it. The government's going in the right direction, but it's transitional measure, and it does not completely solve the problem long term, and that's because of the size of the biomass challenge.
Could I just add on there also about power to liquid fuels, which are essentially synthetic fuels. Again, we've got a huge challenge with the amount of renewable energy that we generate in this country, and again, questions about where should that renewable electricity capacity be directed. Should it be directed to producing synthetic fuels, or should it go to home heating or wherever? And obviously the more that we need, the more we have to build out, which would challenge our attempts to reach the renewable targets for 2030. I just wanted to point out as well that the SAF mandate says 22% by 2040, but when the Climate Change Committee recently produced its CB7 recommendations, it was looking at expecting about 17% of fuel to be SAF by 2040, so they are less optimistic about the delivery of SAF than the mandate.
Right. Okay.
Can I just say this is a very important point that's just been made, and that is that as you start to scale the use of green electricity across sectors and biomass, you have to take a cross-sector approach. And I think that's something the government should push more on, is understanding how they control or they incentivise the right cross-sector approach. Paul Monk, who is the Chief Scientist of DESNES, and Sarah Sharples, Chief Scientist of the Department of Transport, are very hot on this, sort of funded us to do work at the Aviation Impact Accelerator. This really is something that we need to understand, because if you take resource away from a sector that could use it better, you can be causing more damage than you're doing benefiting in the sector you're in. And so an example of that would be 1 unit of green electricity in a heat pump is 3 units of heat. 1 unit of green electricity making fuels is 1/3 of a unit of fuel. So there's about a factor of 9 different in that use. And you have to be very careful about how you use resources across sector.
Another question for yourself, Professor Miller. Does SAF bring any secondary benefits other than reducing carbon emissions, obviously? Is it going to help with air quality or anything else?
So I think that's a really good question. There is some evidence that SAF may reduce the effect of the cloud formation, the contrails, and also in terms of health and particulates, that will make the case, but I'm not an expert on that. However, I think if we're talking about contrails, particularly in terms of non-CO2 effects, the cloud formation, there is a much quicker way of doing it, and that's contrail avoidance. That's moving aircraft at altitude. These areas of airspace that form clouds, what happens is where the white line behind a plane doesn't do any damage, but if it happens to go through one of these pancaked areas of space that's about to form clouds, it can grow a cloud. Now, because these are pancake shaped, changing altitude slightly can stop this happening. And this is a real opportunity for the UK to lead and become the first blue skies country by launching these trials. That's exciting.
Thank you. A question to Mr. Beckford. Well, similar question. Is the level of SAF production, as well as its usage, going to be enough to achieve what the government's trying to achieve?
That's a very good question and is unfortunately very difficult. This is the slightly more pessimistic side of this discussion, that it's pretty likely that we're not going to reach the desired levels on the sort of current policy track that we have. The Jet Zero strategy, for example, suggests that we'll have under construction 5 dedicated SAF plants in 2025, and unfortunately none are on their way. There is some small-scale byproduct of SAF in one plant in Phillips 66. And the CCC highlight this in their 7th carbon budget advice. So they say that unfortunately 17% of fuel in 2040 will be made up of SAF when the government's target is 22%. Now that's quite a big gap, so the government is going to have to work out how it wants to bridge that. Is it going to try and go further and faster, or is it going to have to make changes to the mandate itself? fundamentally, there are some big challenges around SAF. The economics of SAF are pretty uncertain. The CCC suggests actually that engineered removals may be more cost effective in that sort of 2040 time period. So that's a real challenge. And ultimately, there's a big supply constraint challenge. So as Professor Miller already highlighted, that we're currently on a pretty low level of SAF. It's less than 1% globally at the moment, but the level of scaling is going to be a real challenge. So, the majority of airlines right now are not putting off-take agreements in place for new producers. Banks aren't giving final investment decisions on plants. So there's a whole bunch of challenges that need to be squared away. Even the government's revenue certainty mechanism, for example, doesn't really solve where we're getting the feedstock from, where we're getting those biomass sources from. So even in that situation, there's a real uncertainty that is surrounds SAF. Now, while it will play a transitional role, I think it's really important in this debate, and hopefully the recommendations from this committee can highlight this, the kind of impact that SAF can have. Too often it's talked about as a kind of, guilt-free flying or eco flying is available from SAF. That unfortunately isn't the case. The figures that are bandied about of 70%, 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from SAF all too often would make you think, if you're sat on that plane, that 80% fewer emissions are coming out of the back. That isn't the case. Those emissions are life cycles, so that's from the production and the processing of those fuels. So actually, they burn almost exactly the same as kerosene does. And if you're making synthetic fuel, then in exactly the same way because they're chemically the same. So we need to be a bit clearer on what SAF actually is. It's a transitional technology that has a role to play, but we need to look beyond SAF as well to some of the technologies we've already mentioned, and it comes back to the scale. The biggest lever that we have to pull right now is that demand management lever, as well as some of the important things around airspace modernisation and contrail avoidance, but we can't just say SAF will take care of the problem. We need to think about it now and pull the levers that we actually have that we know that work.
Final question on SAF. Sorry to persist with it.
Go for it.
If our SAF production, should our SAF production be from the UK? And if it is from the UK, is that going to make it more expensive?
I can start off on that. So it's important to recognise, in answering the question about the UK, that there's two parts to the question. So the first is, should the biomass come from the UK? And as I've already told you, the amount of waste biomass that's needed is on the same order of magnitude, if not greater than the total global amount. And we're not a great country for waste biomass. So the waste biomass should not be coming from the UK, or the vast majority of it shouldn't, and we have to control that very carefully. The second question is, should the SAF plants production be put in the UK? And I would say probably yes. So we have a traditional oil, gas and petrochemicals industry in the north of England. We have access to renewables. We are well placed to put in place carbon capture and storage. And it would also help us lead in setting international standards of how biomass was sourced if we were doing it. I think the government needs to be careful, though, about the type of plants it invests in. They probably should invest in plants where there's a significant technology add, good jobs, not the cheaper, less environmental SAFs. So you have to say the SAF plants that produce the biggest technological advantage in jobs, and the SAF plants that have the true system's net benefit to the environment, I would invest. And these are what are called synthetic fuels and also carbon capture. They're the two areas I would go for.
I just wanted to add on just about the feedstock question. At the moment, the SAF mandate permits up to 100% of heifer, which is basically used cooking oil, and that goes down to 71% in 2030. Other countries are putting in place SAF mandates as we speak as well, and I think you're correct that we've led quite quickly on this. We've got our SAF mandate up and running, and that's why things are happening. But other countries, including China, is going to have a SAF mandate quite soon. So obviously the competition for those renewable feedstocks is going to go elsewhere in the world, and supply and demand economics means that will lead to price rises. So I think, if we're going to do it in the UK, it's got to be something that isn't used cooking oil, and it needs to be something that does create jobs. And I think, if you look at what happened recently with the Grangemouth Project Willow, there's some great ideas in there, but, it really needs a lot of analysis to work out what's the best use of existing facilities and which generates the most jobs and which is the most cost effective.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Barry Gardner.
Very briefly, and my apologies for arriving late. If you've covered it, then just say so. Two very quick questions. The European report that said that the growth in aviation would account for the SAF that is now to be included, and therefore the emissions level would still be the same. That's the first question, if you comment on that. And the second is the impact on land use and land use change as a result of going down the SAF route.
I know which report you're thinking of, but I haven't got it to hand, and I can't And I do remember the discussion, but do you know which one?
I haven't got the report, but in general, I can answer your question. So, if you're thinking globally, aviation is going to more than double, and that rise is through a rise in the middle class in Asia, Africa and South America taking their first flight, and I would say they have their right to take their first flight. And if you look at the rate at which we are predicting to scale SAF, even in this country, that is, most of that rise is not being covered by the increase in SAF. So that's important to understand. The land use is a very important one. We have to make sure, because of the scale, because aviation is one of the biggest users of potentially of waste biomass, it's very important. I think there's an opportunity for aviation to lead in setting the standards for other sectors to use. And I think the government is well placed in the UK, as it is ahead of the curve with SAF, with the launch of SAFs and the SAF mandate, to set those standards and try to get them taken on internationally. But it's critically important that we make sure land use doesn't change and we use the right sort of waste biomass that can be policed.
Thank you very much. Well, Mr. Beckford, Mr. Hicks and Professor Miller, very much appreciate you coming and giving the evidence today. I now call this sitting suspended. Order. there. Wonderful. Okay, well, I'm very pleased to be here now at the second of the panel events. We are joined by Dr. Lisa Lavia from the Noise Abatement Society, alongside Ms. Warrington and Mr. Beckford. If I could start with you, Dr. Lavia, if I could just invite you to introduce yourself, your organisation, and your interest in this particular subject that we're discussing today.
Yes, thank you. My name is Lisa Lavia, and I'm Managing Director of the Noise Abatement Society. We are a UK charity. And our primary interest in this topic is in our name. Our remit is to find solutions to noise pollution problems for the public benefit, very wide remit, and we tend to focus on some key areas where we feel that we can make a difference or add some alternative views. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. Ms. Warrington, could I come to you next, please?
Hi, I'm Alethea Warrington, and I'm Head of Aviation, Energy and Heat at climate charity Possible, which works on solutions which cut emissions while also improving people's lives. And our work on aviation focuses on the limits to what can be achieved by technological solutions and the need for fair ways to reduce demand by targeting the most excessive consumption of aviation.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Beckford?
Thank you. I'm Paul Beckford, the Policy Director at the No Third Runway Coalition. So we're a coalition of community groups, local authorities and residents who are opposed to the expansion at Heathrow.
Chair, sorry, I need to declare an interest.
Sorry, my apologies. I should have invited you before we began, or maybe we do it right now. So I think, Ruth, you just wanted to have a declaration of interest.
Yes, I know Paul Beckford because when I was Deputy Leader of Hounslow Council 2010 to 12, the council employed Paul as a consultant on Heathrow issues.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Wonderful. If I could now just invite you in the first instance to explain, I'll start with yourself, Ms. Warrington. Do you accept the need for an increase in passenger capacity in terms of the kind of the interests of the country? We'll get on to the best ways of achieving that, but I think it would be useful to understand for all three of you whether you do accept there is a need for increased passenger capacity.
I think the government is sort of assuming that we have to allow airports to expand as a pathway to achieving economic growth. But I think the case for that really doesn't stack up. The government certainly hasn't convincingly made that case. And we heard in the previous session that the UK already has an absolutely gigantic tourism spend deficit. So that's about 40 billion more leaving the UK as outbound leisure travel to be spent in other countries than comes into the UK. Business travel has remained static for decades. The amount of freight being exported from the UK by weight has also remained static. And all the evidence is that when you have an increase in airport capacity, that doesn't expand access to aviation. All it does is allow the small group of people who already take most of the flights to take even more flights and even more of an increase in that outward spend to other countries. Having said that, if the government does want to increase capacity, then there's certainly cleaner ways to do it, lower carbon, more cost-effective ways to do it than expanding airports. But I think that the case that if you expand airports, that delivers the economic benefit and the growth and the jobs that the government wants to see, that case hasn't been made, and there's sort of very strong economic arguments why that simply won't work.
Okay, we'll get on to some of those, I'm sure, in the rest of this session. Mr. Beckford, what, from your perspective, do you accept the need for the nation to increase its passenger capacity?
I think if you look around, and we heard earlier in the session previously, there's plenty of capacity at airports. What we're lacking is a truly nationally integrated aviation strategy for how we make sure that demand is met equally around the country. And if we've got other policy goals that we're trying to achieve in terms of what we used to be called levelling up or spreading growth around the country, then there's other ways that we could look to do that. And the Secretary of State has the powers to control that as well. So it's an interesting one. There's making best use is official government policy. It's a 2017 document. It probably could do with an update to understand what's going on in terms of the expansions at all airports. We need to look at the system as a whole to understand where the demand is and how we can best meet it going forwards.
And Dr. Lavia, do you accept the need for increasing passenger capacity?
Our view as an organisation is we're policy neutral on this particular question. However, our main concern is the growth in noise impacts on community. The existing impacts they're already suffering and those that they will suffer should there be an increase. We do not believe that these impacts are inevitable, nor has enough done to reduce the ones that communities are already experiencing. So we come at this question primarily from, if there's no noise effect on communities, ultimately, then that is our remit. That is our main concern. How to achieve that is a subject for much debate, and I can go into more detail as we go along.
Well, that's helpful. Thank you. Ms. Warrington, we'll come back to you. So you referred there to alternative ways of achieving passenger capacity instead of airport expansion. What would you be advising government prioritise if they decide that passenger capacity is their priority instead of airport expansion? What would be things they should be considering?
So there's huge potential to make better use of our existing international low-carbon transport infrastructure. So the Channel Tunnel is currently really, really underused compared to the amount of capacity and the amount of passengers who could be travelling through it. We know that a lot of the journeys from UK airports are to European destinations. These are journeys that could and should be done by train, and there is potential for a really, really large increase in capacity along the Channel Tunnel. We've got a report coming out within the next few months that is looking at how to increase it by around 5 times. So that's a really, really sizable increase. We think that pretty much negates the argument for any airport capacity, even if you do want an increase in passengers. And of course, these are journeys that are very, very low carbon, and they don't have the air pollution impacts, the noise pollution impacts that are of so much concern at airports. It's also a lot quicker and cheaper to make the changes that are needed to increase capacity along that existing infrastructure of the Channel Tunnel than it is to build new airport infrastructure, particularly new runways, which will take easily 15 years or so. So if the government does think that increasing international travel from the UK is a pathway to economic growth, there are much, much better ways to do that don't cause all these environmental harms. And so we would really urge the government to look at that in a lot more detail before greenlighting all these airport expansions.
Yeah, and I mean, just be specific in terms of within that envelope of airport expansion, sorry, not airport expansion, airline passenger capacity. What are the alternative ways that government might be able to achieve that? I understand what you're saying about rail and Channel Tunnel, but if they were sort of determined that, airline capacity they wanted to increase, what alternatives to airport expansion would be wise for them to consider?
Well, we've already heard that actually, capacity is not a block for the airports that currently exist, but I think there's sort of underutilised capacity. And at the moment, I think they're all sort of, trying to get in there and get permission to go ahead. But actually, the UK does not suffer from a shortage of aviation capacity. And I think that looking for ways to increase flights from the UK is sort of the wrong question. We should be asking how severe is the environmental harm that this is causing, and will it bring any kind of economic benefits that could counterbalance that? And I think that is a case that just hasn't been made or properly considered by the government.
And turning to that position that government have asserted that airport expansion is important for economic growth, just take me through why you disagree with that analysis.
I think we've sort of already covered a lot of the key points, but one of the key factors is the UK's huge leisure tourism spend deficit. That's about 41 billion more leaving the UK than coming in. If you look at the history of airport expansions and where that capacity has gone, it's not creating jobs, it's not increasing exports, it's just allowing the small group of wealthy frequent flyers to take even more frequent holidays abroad, exporting even more tourism spend. We saw during the pandemic that there was a boost to the UK's domestic tourism industry because demand was shifting from overseas leisure travel to the UK. So I think there's just really no convincing argument at all that expanding airports will lead to economic growth. And, as we've discussed, the cost of the climate, and as we'll come on to, the noise pollution, the air pollution, the health impacts, the costs to the NHS from that are potentially really sizable. So I think the costs and benefits just really don't stack up.
When you refer to the tourism deficit, obviously people fly out of the UK but also fly into the UK. It's part of a tourism strategy as well as people moving overseas. Is there evidence that you have that suggests that the increased airport capacity would add to our tourism deficit rather than improve it?
Yeah, absolutely. The sort of ratio of outbound to inbound travel for the UK is about 3 to 1. And if you look at the history of adding additional capacity to airports over the past 20 years, if anything, that has just made that ratio worse.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Beckford. In terms of your coalition refers specifically to Heathrow. In terms of the case that you make, how much of that is primarily about Heathrow specifically, and how much of it will be relevant to all other airport expansion, whether Gatwick, Leeds, Bradford, Doncaster, Fairfield, or any other?
I think if you look at the issues associated with any airport expansion, Heathrow is the largest airport in the country, and therefore it covers all those issues, and the same issues will arise in terms of noise, air pollution at other airports. As collectively as a coalition, we've never sought to export the problems that arise from the threat of expansion to other places. But I think at Heathrow, you have to understand that the size of the airport means that 28% of all people across Europe are impacted by aircraft noise, for example, live around the Heathrow communities. That's more than Madrid, Schiphol, Frankfurt, Charles de Gaulle added together. It's more than any other airport. It's 7 times more than Manchester, about 50 times more than Gatwick in terms of the number of people impacted by the operations. So the sheer scale of the proposed expansion at Heathrow just makes it so much more impactful and devastating to loads of communities. And that's before you start talking about the complete destruction of the villages around Heathrow, loss of homes, and also the blight. People have been living with this for 2-3 decades, this persistent threat, and the sort of health and mental health impacts of that as well are really devastating on local communities.
And I mean, just in terms of one of the things people think about Heathrow is obviously a huge provider of jobs. If there's no expansion, well, those people who are working there, they'll all still have their jobs. But effectively, if there's expansion, there's lots of people who aren't now currently employed who might start getting jobs. So, I mean, who advocates for those people who might get the jobs in the future?
Well, hopefully they're elected representatives, but yeah, we represent some of those as well. And actually, we've got members of our coalition who work at the airport, who don't want to see it get any bigger. They'd rather see it improve the way it operates as an piece of infrastructure. And we've also seen as well, specifically on Heathrow, while there was promises of lots of jobs, for example, when Terminal 5 opened, I think a pledge of 15,000 by the airport, we've never seen the actual figures of the numbers of jobs created. So you always have to take these figures with a little bit of a pinch of salt. The government's own analysis around the airport's national policy statement, which was not really a national policy statement at all, it only ever really addressed Heathrow, said that there'd be a big displacement of jobs, so people who might have been working on HS2 or other engineering infrastructure projects would come down and work, and so those under Treasury sort of Green Book guidelines shouldn't really be counted in the economic benefit case because they're actually temporary jobs that will be transition and disappear, they're not long-term jobs. The other issue we've always had as well is some of the quality of the jobs that we created. Yes, there'll be lots of jobs maybe in retail, and everybody has a right to a job, but actually in terms of we're talking about upskilling the workforce and improving their opportunities for better work going forward, it's not clear that sort of expanding shopping malls at Heathrow is the best way to do it, and that's a big driver of the sort of economic case that the airport's always put forward.
Thank you for that. Well, we were referring there to who was going to advocate for all these people, and we're very fortunate to have Ruth Cadbury, MP for Brentford and Isleworth. I think you wanted to come in on that point.
I'm here because I'm chair of the Transport Committee rather than a representative of people who work at Heathrow, and I think your point, Chair, is that anybody who has a job already at Heathrow wouldn't be threatened by expansion not going ahead, which the government, the Heathrow appeared to suggest, according to the Telegraph, that they can't afford to anyway. But the point I wanted to point is we've been assuming, have we been assuming that expansion means more runways. Because at Heathrow, expansion could also happen because Heathrow is running at capacity, at full capacity. That expansion can, at some of these airports, mean an increase in flights if the caps were released and more flights would be permitted to fly from those airports, or some others have a passenger cap. In fact, actually, Heathrow has a passenger cap. So the impacts of carbon emissions, noise and pollution, are those also an issue without runway expansion, but with more flights and more passengers going through those runways?
Absolutely, and I think what we should remember is that...
Through those airports, sorry.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. I mean, I think that the issue is that these things are already a problem with the current size of aviation, even before we have an expansion in any capacity or an increased passenger cap or any new runways. It's already causing serious environmental harms in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, the local impacts, the air pollution, the air quality, the impacts that has on people's health. London is a city that has 6 airports. It's the city that has the worst air pollution from particles emitted by aviation of any city in the world. So I think that the question we should be asking is less, well, you know, how much expansion should we have, and more, is the current amount safe for the climate, safe for people living in the area, safe for people living in, in the quite wide radius of impacted communities nearby, and is this the most effective, low carbon, cost effective way to have international transport?
Let's pick up on that, specifically on the noise. We know that people in communities around Heathrow are 4 times more likely to develop cardiovascular problems. That's academic evidence from...
I think we're coming on to noise specifically. I just wanted to ask about the environmental impact of expansion on existing runways. Yeah. Because you particularly mentioned in Ms. Warrington, you talked about the environmental impact of the construction of another runway. But would I be right in saying that putting more flights and or more passengers on existing runways, but increasing that, is there still significant environmental impacts of doing that?
There absolutely is, yeah. And I think that the reason why the new runways get so much attention and so much concern is that those are sort of locking in a huge increase. But I think you're completely right that even expansions that don't involve the construction of new runways, even expansions that's just sort of increasing use of existing runways, are still worrying and harmful, and I think shouldn't be going ahead.
I think specifically to your point is that there's a big concern amongst communities around Heathrow that if the third runway doesn't happen for whatever reason, cost and climate impact, is that Heathrow will want some form of expansion going forwards, and I understand with the 2 runways you could probably get another 70,000 movements, but that would involve the introduction of something called mixed mode, where you take off and land on both runways at the same time. So that would see a greater intensification of use of the current flight paths, which would mean more noise for people under those flight paths, and it would also potentially change the way it operates as well. So you're going to have different, at the moment that happens between 6 and 7 a.m. That mixed mode operation, that would happen all day. So you then lose what people really value, which is the respite, that break from noise when they switch the runways halfway through the day. And that's a real concern. I think is that a consolation prize that Heathrow are trying to get, and we're really worried about it as well.
Thank you very much.
I think Dr. Lavia wanted to come in. We certainly haven't forgot you. We've got plenty of you in a bit, but let me bring you in on that, and then I'll come to Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. It was just a brief comment on the economic analysis, and I can cover more of the detail in later comments, but just to say, as we're on the topic of it, that we generally don't take issue with the government's economic analysis as it has been. What we are calling for is the need for that economic analysis to be reviewed in light of recent evidence on health, well-being, and the mental health effects of noise. And there's several studies underway funded by the DFT and also the CAA that have yet to report. And so our main issue with the current economic analysis is, what does that really look like in light of the current evidence, just from the research community, let alone that the government is actually funding at the moment?
And sorry, just to clarify what you're saying there, you're saying you accept that the economic analysis the government have said, but you're saying because of the health and other well-being impacts, government that should alter their policy or their economic analysis to take into account these negative health and well-being impacts, are you?
Yes, in the sense that we don't, while we may have, and this wasn't a question we were ever given, but while we may have considered the previous economic, or let's say the current economic analysis on its face value, we no longer can, because we believe that that economic analysis needs to be revised in light of current evidence.
Okay, thank you very much. Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. And I wanted to just address the issue of how fair the distribution of flights across the UK population is, and if it's not fair, what could be done to remedy this? I don't know who would feel best qualified to answer this.
I can start. Well, I already mentioned that there's a number of people impacted by noise around the Heathrow community. So 28% of people across Europe impacted by aircraft noise live around Heathrow. So the southeast of England is already one of the most congested pieces of airspace in the world. There's 6 airports, that makes it highly complex. There's a high volume of traffic, and there's a huge dense population which overflies it. That makes it very difficult to manage. And separately to all the expansions that are going on, we are in the process of redesigning the entirety of our airspace as well, just to throw an extra spanner in the works. And that process is not looking at can we move the flights, can we make it more equitable, because we purport that there are economic benefits from aviation activity, I don't deny, but there's also huge harms, and are we sharing those benefits and harms equally around the country? Probably not at the moment. Now some of that will be down to airport economics, and there's other reasons why you have hub airports and all the rest of it, but actually the harms being done are not shared equally, and we're not really understanding what that means in terms of health cost, in terms of the wider analysis.
And that's been excluded from the economic analysis that the government has done, presumably?
I'm not sure what economic analysis the government has done. We seem to be quoting figures produced by the aviation industry, which is always difficult to take as read. So we would welcome that as further both economic, health and environmental cost benefit analysis to be redone. So with the national policy statement, there was an appraisal of sustainability. It looks at some of these issues. It tried to put monetary cost on them, but as Professor Lavia has just pointed out, that was 7-8 years ago. Things have moved on significantly in terms of the research, and to the DfT's credit, I know they're looking at some around how you improve the monetisation health costs of noise. Those should be factored into the decision-making process before any final decisions are taken on expansions, because then at least we have the full information available and we're not just taking one side of the argument or the other. We've got a more comprehensive understanding of the problems.
And to come in as well on sort of who benefits from aviation, that really is incredibly unequal. I think it was mentioned in the first panel that half of people don't fly at all in any given year. Most people fly rarely, even if they do fly at all. And really, the sort of a lot of the harm from aviation is really caused by just a small group of people with the most excessive consumption. So the frequent flyers, the most frequent flyers, the private jet users. And if you look at the sort of distributional impacts on local communities, as Paul mentioned, you've got a situation, for example, London City Airport is in a relatively poor borough. It's got high air pollution. The people living in that borough are not going to be going to London City Airport and taking a private jet, and yet the expansion policy is encouraging more and more luxury flights, private jets to come into London City Airport that will cause serious harm, noise pollution, air pollution to the local area. And so I think that the costs and benefits of aviation expansion will increase inequality. They'll increase the harms that are experienced by populations which are already at higher risks, whereas the benefits will go to people who are already very high consumers of aviation.
Thank you. And just turning to our online guest, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
In terms of growth in aviation and
across the country, so the distribution of flights, but also I think the points that the other panellists were making about the distribution of both benefits and adverse impacts of aviation. Just if there were any views you wanted to add.
Yeah, our primary concern is to consider any questions in relation to growth, existing aviation capacity or indeed growth, is from the perspective of how the impacts are measured and assessed in relation to noise and the health, mental health and well-being effects. I can speak a bit more about that now in terms of our views, or save that for another question. Whatever you prefer.
Probably for another one, but no, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just ask one question of Ms. Warrington, please?
We do need to move on, but quick ones.
The emphasis of your evidence so far has been that this is all about rich people benefiting from flights. 57% of those who use flights do it for going on their holidays. It's a choice that they make to go abroad. Many of them were from low-income families. They save up to go abroad, and you've also said that expansion made it more possible for those people because it brought the cost down. Are you really suggesting that people who want to get away on a holiday after a year's work should be denied the opportunity to do so?
I think nobody is suggesting that, and if you look at the policies that we have designed to try to reduce demand for aviation, they are very explicitly designed to avoid doing that. That's why when we talk about things like a frequent flyer levy, we talk about there being no tax or reduced tax levied on somebody's first return flight in a year compared to the current situation. So, there's the potential for occasional access for aviation to be cheaper. What we're talking about constraining is the excessive end of aviation, the people who are taking 4 or 6 or 8 or 10 return flights in a year, and those are the people who are the wealthiest in our society. They're the most responsible for pollution. They certainly could afford to take a holiday by rail rather than by train. And because the access to aviation is so unequal, you actually could certainly avoid the need for airport expansions, but you could also reduce total demand for air travel just by targeting reductions at quite a small proportion of people, the most frequent flyers. And I think it's important to add as well that the current situation is not it's not supporting access to occasional air travel. Or the measures that the earlier panel discussed, so things like alternative aviation fuels, are going to add costs. And the larger that the aviation industry tries to go, the greater those costs will be. So it's certainly possible that expansion could actually increase the cost of a family's annual summer holiday somewhere warm because of the increased overall cost. But it is also definitely the case that it's really important to have policy design that is as progressive as possible and doesn't have these regressive impacts, and that doesn't price the poorest out of the skies while leaving the wealthiest few to continue flying. But I think certainly no one is talking about telling people they can't have an annual holiday. That's absolutely not what we're calling for.
Thank you very much. Martin Rhodes.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Warrington, in terms of, I want to look at issues around air quality. To what extent would the current proposals around expansion impact air quality for the local communities?
I think they would have a really negative impact. And I think it's important to remember that they're already having a negative impact. There's already sort of measurable worse health impacts in communities living close to airport expansions. And there's, I just really struggle to see any justification for making that situation worse. It would pile cost onto the NHS, which of course all of us have to pay for.
In terms of understanding the causes of that, in terms of air quality issues, the impact, is that presumably primarily the flights? Is it also the construction work? Is it also the travel to and from, if you've got more people using the airport? And what is the sort of roughly, we would see as the proportions of that?
So if you're sort of in the vicinity of an airport, so close to the airport boundary, then for nitrogen oxides, the split is roughly 50-50 between those that derive from the airport and from flights and from road transport. And the breakdown for the airport itself is roughly 30% from planes and 20% from ground operations. And obviously as you go further away from the airport itself, then the proportion from road transport increases. But I think also in terms of the broader policy picture, there's a lot of really good work happening to try and reduce those harmful emissions from road transport. So things like the ULEZ, which is really having a positive impact in terms of making London's air less dangerous. And it seems, from every possible angle, it seems very counterproductive to be doing all that really good work, encouraging people not to drive the most polluting vehicles into the centre of London, and at the same time expanding airports, expanding frequent flying, expanding private jet use to London City Airport. That is just so intensely polluting. It seems like very counterproductive policy making.
And how key is this as an element to meeting our overall targets in terms of air quality? Because we've had evidence as a committee from the Office for Environmental Protection, which essentially suggests that we were making good progress overall in terms of air quality in recent years, but that progress has slowed. So in terms of the impact in terms of airport expansion, in terms of what will it have in terms of how big an impact will it have on those overall figures around air quality?
Yeah, so the improvements that have been happening in recent decades have been largely because of reductions in emissions from road transport. The dirtiest vehicles are getting off the roads, things like the ULEZ, electric vehicles. And airport expansions obviously would have an impact on that, and that impact would be the sort of greatest around airport communities. I think as well it's worth flagging in terms of the legal limits that the UK's limits are lower than those recommended by the World Health Organization. So harm to people's health is still being caused even within the legal limit. And for ultra-fine particles which are emitted by aircraft, and we actually don't have any kind of legal limit or recommendation. We don't know what a safe level of exposure is. We might already have breached that limit for just with airports' current operations without even allowing any expansions. And so I think responsible policy making would sort of determine what is the current level of exposure, is that safe, is that dangerous, before even thinking about adding even more air pollution to inflict that on airport communities.
And Mr. Beckford, in terms of how could we mitigate against the environmental health impacts of air pollution in terms of on local communities, what could be done in terms of mitigation?
The best thing would be to invest in public transport, and that has a huge cost associated with that, particularly if you want to expand an airport. And some of the aspirations around Heathrow in terms of getting numbers of people on road off the cars and into rail and buses mean that they need to invest beyond what's already being planned by TfL in terms of like tube upgrades or Crossrail or other rail schemes which don't currently have any budgets for. TfL also did some analysis that showed that any expansion would result between 100 and 200,000 increased trips, both on public transport and on roads. As a result of that expansion, that's going to increase the congestion times in local road networks and increase pollution, increase engine idling. That's also a problem even if we're all driving around in electric vehicles, because you've got particulates from brakes and tyres, which hasn't been resolved. So the best mitigation is not to make the problem we've got already worse. If you're going to try and address it, the other way is to heavily incentivise those public transport investments, and that has a cost associated with it that won't only be met. I think we need to be honest with ourselves about that. There will be a huge taxpayer contribution to that, and that means money that can't be spent by London or other councils on other improvements to the network, which is a real challenge for them.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ruth Cadbury.
Yes, a geographical question. So the government's focused on airport expansion mainly in and around London, which has 6 airports. As London is the city most impacted by aviation pollution, actually in the world, does this concern you?
Yeah, it's really, really worrying. You know, we're all already breathing dirty air. This is worse for people around airport communities, particularly Heathrow, because of the combination of the airport and the motorways. And this, it has a real impact on people's lives, on excess mortality. I think one study found that Heathrow's operations are currently responsible for 50 deaths a year, but if it's allowed to expand, that will be 150. I mean, that's a huge cost to people's lives, to our NHS, for benefits that just really, really don't seem to be, the case that will bring benefits just really, I think, hasn't been convincingly made.
And Paul Beckford, the GLA has environmental aims and presumably some targets. So, and we've got expansion plans or approvals for Heathrow, Gatwick and Luton. So what would those expansion plans, if they all go ahead, what impact would that have on the GLA's targets?
Well, I think it will make everything it's trying to achieve, particularly in terms of air pollution, a lot harder, because they are planning to deliver things that are within their control, and airport expansions beyond their sort of planning authority, and that means they then have to try and make those investments to support those network expansions. Rail links to Gatwick, for example, would require a big investment to deliver. Similar for Heathrow, there's been long mooted a western rail access and a southern rail access, which are going to go through existing train paths, but you need the money to make those things happen, and there's nothing in the network rail budgets currently that I'm aware of that will help deliver that. That puts extra onus on the GLA in terms of what it can do. And I think it's also worth flagging that when the Heathrow expansion was previously discussed in Parliament, some of the analysis around that showed that we're in danger of eroding some of the improvements that have been delivered by Transport for London over the last 20 years by pursuing expansion at airports like Heathrow. So you're undoing the good work that's already been done in terms of improving the public transport network.
Would you include the impact that the ULEZ is already seemed to be having? Is that success also in jeopardy? Should particularly the Heathrow and Luton expansion? City Airport and Heathrow go ahead?
I think so, but also if I was being cynical, perhaps it helps drive some much needed revenue towards the Mayor of London to utilise as well. But again, when we looked at when the AMPS was discussed in Parliament, it was looked at the size of the expansions that were required on public transport networks, and in order to achieve those modal share shifts that Heathrow had promised as part of that process to deliver, you're going to need a sort of almost a ULEZ around Heathrow itself, and I think the region was around £40 for everybody entering it. So that would be the way that you would drive that behavioural shift to get people onto public transport. So there's a real challenge there for policymakers on how do you deliver that. I appreciate that might not be politically palatable to some as well, so it's a difficult solution.
Heathrow Airport in terms of getting people who work there in and out.
Yeah.
Thank you. Barry Gardner.
Thank you. If I can turn to Ms Lavia and ask, can you just outline for us the health impacts of living with excess noise?
I can speak about them in general terms. I'm not myself a health expert, but I can point to existing research and follow up with information after my comments, after the session, in addition to my comments. But broadly speaking, I'll just set out the context for how I can comment on this, is that broadly speaking, the health effects of noise are both psychological and biological. And in relation to those pathways, the indicator of noise annoyance affects people both psychologically and biologically. So we have two pathways to health effects. There's others, but our main concern in relation to noise annoyance is that it is the most prevalent community response in terms of noise to noise from aviation. And so to drill down in that with a bit more detail, the objective noise levels at source of a plane or any ground operations at an airport and the health effects on communities are our primary concern, along with the subjective and perceptual effects of noise that also contribute to the effects on mental health and quality of life. And these effects can also be combined. So both the objective and subjective reactions, so the physiological as well as the psychological reactions to noise can also combine to affect health, mental health, and quality of life. And there is a growing amount of research on this, especially in the last 2 decades. There has been considerable research on the biological effects of noise, and there is growing number of researches on the subjective effects of noise, because the annoyance indicator, how we respond to noise with annoyance, is related to our humans' fight or flight response. So it's a stressor to the body. And so there's a pathway there for the health effects.
Look, the written evidence that we've received speaks of the impacts of noise pollution causing noise-induced hearing loss, and high blood pressure, heart disease, sleep disturbances, stress, as well as the what you've termed the annoyance element, the cognitive impairment, the sleep disturbance, and the cardiovascular disease that comes from that. What evidence has there been that it actually comes from that in areas around airports, such as Heathrow, that there is spikes of noise-induced hearing loss and all of these other clinical factors?
I myself am not an expert on noise-induced hearing loss, and I can't actually speak to that evidence. The work that I've been involved in has been with researchers working in the areas of other biological effects related to the stress response, so cardiovascular disease, dementia, diabetes, and those sorts of responses. But in relation to how, which there is strong evidence to the biological effects of noise. In relation to the subjective effects, those can be classified under the banner of a dimension called non-acoustic factors, which are defined most generally can be understood as factors that affect the human response to sound in context, either positively or negatively, other than the objective, measurable acoustic elements, as in noise level.
Right. No, I understand that, but that wasn't the question that I asked. What I'm asking you to do, and if you can't provide the evidence now, then perhaps you could write to us. But I think it'd be really helpful if you could set out for the committee, perhaps in writing, any studies which have looked specifically at the impact on airport communities versus a control group where there is clear evidence that increased physical and mental health has been impaired in relation to the airport community vis-a-vis the control community. Because it seems to me that we're looking very specifically here at the impact around an airport community. And therefore we need that evidence, not generalized evidence that says we know noise pollution causes these things. Okay?
Yes, thank you. And just to say, yes, absolutely, there are many studies on relationship to aviation noise and health, and I can send some comments.
That's what we need. Thank you. Thank you. Can you talk us through perhaps the regulations around noise pollution for airports? Are they strong enough? And do you think that they could play an additional role in any future airport expansion?
Our general view is that the regulations, in terms of their intent, are about right, because all of the regulations governing airport expansion, whether it's the DCO process or whether it's smaller airports not subject to DCO but other planning regulations, all in the main have as an overall goal, and I'm just paraphrasing, to improve health and well-being of residents and to support expansion or growth, not at the expense of environmental and health impacts. Now, the detail around how schemes are assessed based on the significance of impacts is where we do take issue with the present, not the regulations, but how schemes are assessed. And that goes back to the earlier comment, which I made and also Paul referred to, that the assessment of current plans and schemes need to be understood within the context of the best available current evidence and on health, mental health, and community well-being effects. And we don't feel that that's being taken into account well enough at this time.
If we're looking at the other sorts of mitigations that perhaps could be made rather than those installed on planes and the limits of numbers and times of flights, what else could be done to reduce noise pollution at airports and for those communities?
Well, again, going back to the categories of non-acoustic factors or non-acoustic measures, and I'll just note, and I can send information on this, we've recently been involved with the publishing of an international standard on categories of non-acoustic factors that take into account decades of evidence and studies on these. There's broadly 4 areas to consider, one of which is the tangible or physical characteristics of the environment. So from that perspective, there are many potential design solutions that can help to mitigate the effects of noise and improve the quality of the sound environment, and thereby mitigate the effects of the impacts on communities. But that has to be done based on a good quality, effective assessment of the range of factors affecting communities, both acoustic and non-acoustic. But in terms of physical measures that could be taken, they run the range of the types of building materials that are used in the built environment, the quality of insulation and the building quality of homes, vegetation, water, natural features, good quality blue. There's many design options to improve the acoustic environment for communities, but they can be very expensive and in some cases arguably unfeasible to put into place after the fact, which is a huge problem, of course. But also what's meaningful for communities needs to be done, again, in relation to what is going to be salient and relevant to them. And that does need to be assessed at a local case-by-case basis.
And can technology such as hybrid or battery-powered planes, do you think, is it possible that they could play a role in reducing noise pollution?
Well, they can in the sense of reducing noise at source. However, the human response to sound is only related in about a third of the response is related to the noise at source and acoustic features of noise. About the other third of the human response is related to, again, this area of non-acoustic factors. So there are other factors that affect annoyance with aircraft, regardless of their noise source, whether they're electric or not, or otherwise, whether they're new modes or otherwise. There are other factors that will affect community well-being and annoyance, in not just the noise level. And so those are the things that also need to be taken into account with the introduction of any new technologies.
What are you talking about specifically there?
So, for instance, much publicized in the case of, for instance, eVTOLs or drones, they may not be causing a audible noise effect, but the fact that they maybe look unsightly or there's concerns with their safety. Will they drop out of the sky? What are they being used for? And those would go into a classification of non-acoustic factors around personal and social factors. So there's a whole category of non-acoustic factors that addresses the context and how we interact with communities and what's happening to us in our communities. So yeah.
Okay. Can I turn to our other two witnesses and ask if they have anything that they would like to add on the particular topic of noise pollution, and perhaps ask to what extent communities can be supported, compensated for the impacts that noise pollution is having on them. Does that compensation in any way mitigate the impact on those communities? Would more compensation do that? Your views?
I think there's, obviously more compensation is better, but I think there's, there's a limit to what can be done if your problem is that there's, a very large number of very large planes constantly roaring over your head, particularly if the airport is pushing for less respite, longer hours of flying, more night flights. And, some of the measures that exist are things like better insulation on houses, but, that means people can't open their windows, they can't enjoy their gardens. It's certainly not a complete solution. And in terms of technology, I don't think technology is really going to make a huge impact on noise. Obviously, planes flying on alternative fuels will be just as noisy as planes flying on kerosene, particularly if they're larger planes. I think that airports like to claim that new planes are sort of next generation and they're high tech and they're much quieter, but that just really doesn't stack up. The decreases in noise levels are very marginal. They're certainly more than counterbalanced by the increase in plane size and frequency of planes flying, and even things like electric planes, which obviously are very far off commercial rollout. It's not necessarily the case that they'll be quieter. They might not be, but they certainly won't be silent.
In terms of the mitigation, Heathrow itself will admit that they're not even sure the best effective interventions that they deliver. They've got a noise insulation scheme that gives double glazing and insulation to people, but we don't know if that's the best thing to be doing. And as Ali's alluded to, if it's hot and sunny, you want to open your window, then that mitigation then becomes and doesn't do anything for you in terms of reducing the noise. So we need to make improvements there, and you're right, more money would help. I'm sure that whenever the opportunity to expand comes along, they offer more money for these sort of things because it's in their interest to do so, but actually they could be delivering some of those things now. We know local authorities, for example, as well have to have a higher cost of building public buildings. We have to build them to a higher standard. That has an impact as well. And there's also a whole round of issues around land use planning. So even as aircraft notionally get slightly quieter, the number and frequency of those noise events is what causes the disturbance. And we're seeing, even though they say noise contours shrinking over time, more people live within those boundaries. So actually the health harms are being done to more people. So therefore the solution will cost more to deliver as well. And so there's a never-ending cycle. Again, the best thing we've seen at Heathrow in terms of limiting and mitigating the noise impact has been the air traffic movement cap that was put in place as part of Terminal 5, because that gave people certainty.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. So, Ms. Warrington, Dr. Lavia, Mr. Beckford, we very much appreciate the evidence you've provided to us today, and we bring this sitting to a close. Order.